Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is SockBot, and Happy New Year, I guess. This is the first video I'm actually filming with my face in it since last year, so how's everybody doing? Today, I want to talk a little bit about something I'm doing for the new year, which is quite abnormal to me, because normally I don't really care about the new year, but this year specifically, I wanted to talk about my new process for working on games, specifically in Dreams, but I was also using this for my Little Big Planet level that I was working on last, like, Christmassy time, which I didn't get to finish. But I'm assuming at some point I'll pick that up this year and hopefully finish it for this coming year because I really liked the idea I was going with. But the level that I'm working on right now is part of the larger game that I am working on, which I don't really have a working title for, but it stars the wonderful Rowan, who is one of the characters Media Molecule provided, but didn't really give a lot of backstory on because I wanted to kind of give him some of my own, and I feel like he kind of matches the aesthetic of a lot of the levels I was going for. Anyways, that's another video on the actual purpose of him for these sorts of games. But for this one particularly, I've been making different levels within this game, all of which have a few objectives in the level to collect before you go back to the hub world. There's no hub world yet, but that's definitely coming this year. I was going to work on that first. I decided to push it back a little bit because I got super excited about this level in particular. Now, if you've been around here for a while, you know that I often do talk about the process that I use for creating games, whether it's in Dreams or Little Big Planet, or even back in the day in Stagecraft. I did a video about that a while ago. I'll link it here if I can even find it, or if I didn't remove it yet because it's too embarrassing. But yeah, I generally use the same process for these sorts of games, where I'll kind of come at it from different angles to keep myself going, because I do have pretty bad ADD, and yes, clinically ADD, and that it makes me struggle a lot with keeping up with things like this and finishing stuff, even when I do actually take my medication. But for this particularly, I decided to use a lot of the advice that I've given in the past for things that have helped me keep creating, and also combine it with just general advice that people give for projects like this, where you're creating something large that's either visual or, like, even back when you would make essays for English class or whatever language that you, what's your first language. But for this one particularly, I decided to combine them both by starting off with a sort of planning stage with my own spin on it. So what I did was I went in, picked just a few basic assets, some platforms, some bouncy pads, and some things that I was going to kind of know that those were going to be climbable material once I got to that, so that I could sort of lay out and map out the level to begin with. Now, I've done this in a lot of different ways. Generally, I'll try to at least pick the aesthetic that I want for the level first before I do this, because as I've said in previous videos, one of the things that helps me come up with platforming segments in different sections of a level is to think of the aesthetic and think, oh, well, there will be this sort of thing, like in a forest level, there will be trees, and so jumping between trees makes a great platforming segment, things like that, and then, like, vines will come out of that, and I'll decide to add swinging segments and stuff, and that's normally how I go about it, because it sort of helps itself, where I come up with the aesthetic first, and although it takes time, it tends to push me along to come up with ideas for platforming segments. But this day I was just kind of feeling like I wanted to start creating, and I hadn't come up with an aesthetic at all, and so I started just placing these generic platforms down, generally where they would go, and making it sort of click enough to the point where I could actually jump through the level with the character that I was working with, and without, like, just completely making it like a total skeleton where nothing worked at all, but leaving segments out that would generally take time. And this is advice that I give a lot for anybody that works on games like this, especially amateurs, because there's a lot of stuff in these games, and in general game creation, I've mentioned before, I've been taking classes on Udemy. There's a lot of things that are pretty simple, like creating a generic platformer with platforms to jump between, and then you start to get to things that are more complicated. For example, in this section, I haven't in any of my other segments or any of the other levels within this full game had climbing segments, but I really wanted to add one because I had been playing Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze with my boyfriend recently and having a lot of fun with that, so I decided to add that in as another part of the platforming parts here. And so without trying to program that into the character and into the different objects, I just sort of designated that these yellow pieces would end up being the climbing segments. Now, since then, I've had to sort of switch that around a little bit, and I've decided to change the wall climbing segments from the roof segments, but generally, that's how I made this to start with. And step one really was just taking everything and laying it out in the most rough draft I could possibly imagine. And then as I was working on this for a couple days, I came towards the end of this sort of initial map of at least 4 or 5 areas. I haven't fully decided how I want them to be split up, but there's like a good flow so far. And so I decided to sort of start thinking of an aesthetic. And this was to plan the theme for the level and to hopefully help as I started to sort of run out of ideas, or more likely just get tired because it was the end of the day. And so I was like, okay, let's come up with an aesthetic that'll help me, as I said before, to come up with more ideas for platforming segments and just kind of give me another push to keep going. And so for this one, I, for some reason, had the idea to make it like under the bleachers, and that was just the words that I could think of for this theme. And I didn't have a lot behind that, but I remember when I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time at sports games because my brother was really involved with sports, and I didn't care at all. I know, shocker, the gay gamer doesn't give a damn about games, but, well, yeah, the sport type games anyways. But regardless, I spent a lot of time there with like other little kids playing under the bleachers and just hanging out and not doing nefarious things, because apparently the second that I mentioned that to my boyfriend, he was immediately reminding me, well, that's where everybody goes to make out in high school. But this was me at like age 6, so it was initially a very innocent aesthetic, and well, I might add some funnier references to those nefarious things later, but generally I thought it would be fun. And as I started to think more and more about this aesthetic in my step 2 of deciding on what I wanted it to be, I started looking up different images of under the bleachers. It was an easy Google to make, and I generally knew what I wanted, but it wasn't how do I put this? It wasn't deep enough for me to really make a whole game out of it, or a whole level out of it even, because the platforms would just become too generic if I was using metal slabs for everything. And so I started Googling these things and then thinking, oh, what's under the bleachers? And I started thinking about the different platforms that I had, and I'll get to creating assets for this and replacing them in a second. But as I'm thinking of this aesthetic, the first thing that comes to mind is for the climbing segments to have chewing gum as one of the sections for climbing, because, well, it's sticky. It makes sense in this sort of miniaturized world, or rather, you are miniaturized in this larger world, how climbing across that could make sense, maybe? I don't know, I don't always think these things all the way through, but I thought it seemed like a great idea, and that's where I started to come up with all of the ideas for the different assets from this aesthetic that I came up with. And when I was looking at these images, I also saw something I wasn't really looking for, recognizing that like the lighting and the way that above having this huge bleacher set would cast shadows on everything, and I started thinking, oh, this would be a really interesting way to play with light, play with different lighting effects that I've never used before. It's just not something that I've put into any of my games in any significant way, other than, I mean, maybe the Hollywood Tower Hotel that I made way back in Little Big Planet 1. Just general games that I've worked on have not focused a lot on lighting and haven't taken that as like a major aspect of focus when designing them. And so I decided this would be a great time to play with that, especially because, again, this is a very specific aesthetic to work with for a game like this, but I still think, and as I continue to work with it, I'm seeing that as specific as it is, there's enough to work with here for, frankly, more than one level, but at least one world like this, like what I'm making now. So that was step 2, was coming up with the aesthetic and brainstorming. Long-winded there, but I can show some images here on screen of the things that I was brainstorming for. You can see some of the weirder ones. Not all of it's actually going to end up in the level, but we'll see. But in general, step 2 went really well, and it kind of got me re-excited about introducing these things into the game. But in the same way that the initial aesthetic that I came up with in my second step here was really helpful to kind of push me forward and think of different platforming elements, and that the skeleton kind of pushed me to think of different assets that I would need, like the chewing gum climbing segments, these different steps were kind of working in tandem. And as much as I hate to admit that my English teacher may have been right, I think he may have been right that doing an outline can be incredibly helpful for keeping you going, because if you know where you're going, well, you don't have to constantly think about that or make a decision between 8 different decisions of where you'll go every 5 seconds, which is quite paralyzing for ADD if you didn't know that. And so step 3 was where I really got into the meat of everything. This is where I started taking the ideas that I found in brainstorming and then actually creating these assets and placing them within the world. And this sort of bleeds into whatever you would call the next step, which is like actually building and finishing out the level, but I think that that's a complete separate thing that I haven't quite gotten to yet, so I'll leave this as its own step. But in general, what this meant was taking anything that I had decided, like the platforms, the base platforms, the bleachers, actually putting those in and finding a good enough set of bleachers to use for this from the community, and then deciding, like for the bubblegum, did I need to create it or could I find something for it? I knew I'd need to make the logic, but if I could have found something for it, that would have been great. I couldn't, not in the sense that I wanted, so I used the art piece that I actually found, which was, I think it was made out of like fiberglass or something. This guy made a sculpture of stretched bubblegum, which was like perfect for the rectangular segments I needed, so I used that as inspiration and made my own. It's not perfect, but I think it's good enough, and for me, it's honestly pretty good compared to my other sculptures. But I started creating different things that I needed. I started looking for things that I could modify to suit my needs. For example, the different segments of rising platforms that were initially going to be balancing platforms. I got the idea to use a soda bottle that would explode and kind of shoot a cap of that soda bottle, or I guess in this case it's a beer bottle because I couldn't find a soda bottle, up in the air, so you could kind of use those as platforms. So totally different, like, mechanical segment than what I expected, but it ended up being even more interesting and not something I really would have thought of if I had just been working on using generic pieces to find this. Mind, this was, by the way, my boyfriend's idea, so I had the idea for having a soda bottle down there. I didn't have the idea for making this sort of like shooting at platforming segments, so he helped me a lot with ideas for this level if it wasn't obvious that we talked a lot for this. Well, hopefully now it is. But as I kind of got in the flow of creating these different pieces, these different assets, and replacing the pieces that I had already put in place, I realized that the worries that I had about this process, that's really a very structured process, which, if you know me, is not what I'm really good at, and it's very helpful to me, as you can tell as I talk about it and as I worked through this game. It's super helpful to me for creating my games, but I was very worried that it was going to stifle my creativity, or that I was going to go back through this sort of skeleton and really run into a lot of issues. Mind, I have suggested this as an option before, and I've definitely used it in the past, kind of using generic materials in Little Big Planet especially to create segments before then replacing them once I decided on the full aesthetic of the game, or once I could kind of zoom out and see it and decide that different pieces kind of looked to me like different physical objects that I could bring into the game. And I've used that a lot. I used it on one of the first games that I posted on here, which is my Gravicolor 2 level in Little Big Planet 3. I think it was Little Big Planet 3. And it worked really well, but I've only ever done it for segments. I've never done it from the start for a whole game, because generally I'll finish an obstacle and I'll have already thought of the idea, so I'll want to start using those materials anyways, and that totally makes sense. If you have that sort of vision in mind, I think it's fine to kind of combine parts of the first 2 steps. And you can tell that the first piece that I used for like this generic platform was a concrete slab that I ended up using in the full level because it made sense. And so I think that my fears when I use this for the entire level from the start, or at least I guess it's like 90% of the level at this point, were that it was going to stifle that, when in reality it didn't bore me at all. It didn't stop me from creating new sections, from changing things up, like with the beer bottle, and it didn't, how do I put this? It didn't section things out too much to the point where I felt bored of doing the same thing over and over and over again, which again is something that can really burn you out in this sort of creation. And I think that I speak for not only people like me with ADD, but people in general that struggle with kind of working through an entire project, and one that requires doing a lot of the same thing over and over, which in general, game design can be that way because you're refining a lot of stuff, and it just it's time consuming and it's something that we have to deal with. So mixing it up is very good, but I think having this structure didn't stop me from mixing it up during this step. And I'm not saying I won't go back to the planning stage. I very well may get to later parts in this when I'm creating the assets for the bubblegum section and stuff like that, and find out that things don't work there, or more specifically, I start game testing them and they're just not fun. And I think that those sections are going to happen regardless, so may as well already have some structure in place so that when I get to those segments, I'll be excited to go back to kind of stage one of creating those things, even knowing my aesthetic at this point. But that was pretty much the end of the third step in terms of my explanation. I haven't surely finished it yet, but so far I found that my fears, like I said before, were pretty unfounded in terms of getting bored throughout this. I think that having these steps and really just focusing on one thing at a time helped me do it much quicker. And although altogether it might end up taking longer, no word on that yet. I guess I'll check the footage when I'm fully finished this game. But I think that it really, really helped speed up those segments in particular, especially the brainstorming segment. I mean, I've done that before, but generally I would always have this rule of not just absolutely recreating a picture I found online. But I've realized watching more and more about different game designers that that's a lot of people do that, and it's more that they are taking inspiration from it and creating their own art piece. I mean, obviously, these two things don't look alike, but they're somewhat similar, and you can tell that I was inspired from it. And I think that's okay as long as you're crediting the original creators. And I know that with a lot of 3D games, the assets and the different textures they use for these sorts of things are, in many cases, cough, Resident Evil 4, cough, are actually pictures that people have taken that they obviously get the rights for. But being that I'm not making any money off of this, I'll just credit the owner, and hopefully that will be enough. But I think that's the whole thing so far. Obviously, there's a step 4 to this, and so looking forward to the future. Maybe I'll talk about this in a video, but I think step 4 is just a lot of playtesting and a lot of making sure things work, and then giving the controller to other people and making sure that they work for them too, because, well, that's what game testing is. It's funny that the one part of game design that everybody kind of thinks is the easy part and thinks is the fun part, which is just playing the game over and over to make sure that things work, and something that people would say like, oh, well, that's such an easy idea. Why wouldn't everybody become a game tester? Well, it tends to be kind of the hardest and the most grueling part of the whole the entire process, honestly. And I think that that's surprising to other people. It's never surprised me, but I think it might surprise some people out there. But it's weird. It's weird to think about, I guess is what I'm getting at. Regardless, I'm rambling at this point. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I figured new year, new process was a good topic to go on, especially because for some reason I've just had a lot of discipline within Dreams recently, which is ironic considering how my upload schedule was in December. But I hope you guys are all doing well. Again, apologies for the less videos in December, but hope you guys had a good holiday, and yeah. But Happy New Year once more. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll talk to you guys very soon, but have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye, everybody.